Yes, hello again. Welcome back to your favourite and number one classic dirt bike TV channel, where we continue to try and rediscover some more of those old school vintage scramblers from back in the day. Now, I think we're only about 10 subscribers away from that elusive 15,000 subscribers total, which is absolutely amazing. And when I consider that when I started this YouTube channel many years ago, I never ever thought that it would become as popular as it has. So once again, thanks to each and every one of you out there, and thanks once more for your support of my channel. So next up, we're going to go back to the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show in 2022. I'm going to take a look at another iconic race bike that I came across on the day, and this is a bike that was very much tucked away behind a pile of other machines, and it was actually quite hard to see, but I did manage to spot it, and the owner very kindly wheeled the bike out so we could get some pictures. So without any further delay, let's jump straight into that video and take a look at this very nice 1983 Cagiva 125 WMX. And so, as I said, this featured 1983 Italian-made Cagiva 125 WMX was another one of the bikes that I spotted at the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. But this bike here wasn't up for sale on the day, but it was on display, packed tightly among a few other classics. And because I just couldn't gain any access to get any pictures of the bike, the owner very kindly dug it out into the open so that we could all have a closer look. Now, apparently the bike belonged to Nigel Green, and as I got talking to Nigel on the day, I did comment to him saying about what a nice original bike that it looked, and I said that you don't see many of these older Cagivas these days, and that it was quite a rare bike. But at that time, Nigel just turned to me and he said, rare? Not rare at all. He says, I've got another 30 of these Cagivas in my workshop at home. So it's little wonder that we don't see many of these Italian Cagivas out and about now, when Nigel has more than likely the entire UK's population of Cagivas tucked away safe and sound in his workshop. Now, Cagiva Motorcycles is yet another one of the many smaller Italian motorcycle companies that was founded by Giovanni Castiglione back in 1950 in Varese in Italy, who actually started out by manufacturing very small metal components, and it was Giovanni's sons of Claudio and Gianfranco Castiglione who then went into motorcycle production in 1978. And by 1979, they were producing thousands of units per year, with 8 models, all powered by two-stroke motors. But Cagiva not only built motocrossers, they also manufactured trail bikes and road bikes, and even road racing machines, and a multitude of other types of motorcycles as well. But they were hugely successful in all disciplines of motorcycle sport, and this 1983 WMX 125 was just another of the great machines that they produced in that year. Now, to begin with, the bike had a very light tubular steel chassis, and it was powered by a compact little water-cooled two-stroke 125 engine. And although this small reed valve induction engine looks small enough to even fit in your pocket, make no mistake, this was a sweet little engine that was more than capable of taking on the might of the big four Japanese manufacturers, because it was a buzzy, reliable little power plant that could produce its power best in the bottom to mid-range area, although just like any other smaller 125 two-stroke, it did run out of puff when it got nearer the top end. But if you knew exactly how to ride these bikes by keeping it revving in its sweet spot of the mid-range and then dance up and down on its 6-speed gearbox, then this little 125 motor could certainly propel you quickly around a tight and twisty racetrack. Now, our particular Cagiva motor here looks like it's had a homemade ignition cover manufactured for it from a piece of alloy, which is probably because original casings aren't that easy to come by for these bikes these days. But as you can see, it was fueled through a reed valve block that was fed its gas normally by a 36mm Italian made Delorto carburetor, and it's also been fed its air through a foam filter that was fitted inside this plastic airbox. But as I said, it was a tight, compact, liquid-cooled engine that had a big single radiator mounted up front to help to try and dissipate the heat when that little 125 engine was working hard. But it was still a very quick and very reliable little motor. And once again, the sparks for this little 125 were supplied by way of an electronic CDI ignition system that was housed underneath this replacement alloy cover. Now, our featured Cagiva 125 still appears to have its original stock exhaust expansion chamber from 1983, and there doesn't seem to be much in the way of damage on this pipe for a 39-year-old machine, but our exhaust, of course, is then in turn bolted onto this Italian-made SEM alloy tailpipe, which was a very popular fitment on these 1980 Cagivas. Now, with regards the front suspension on our 83 Cagiva, I'm pretty sure that these are a pair of Marzocchi triple clamps and forks that are fitted onto this bike, although I do know that some of the earlier Cagiva crossers did have sets of 4-cell Italia forks fitted to them at one time, which had a much narrower diameter than the forks fitted onto this bike, although as you know, I have been known to be incorrect in the past, but without asking the actual owner Nigel on the day, I couldn't really confirm that the forks were in fact Marzocchis, but they certainly look all the world like a pair of these Italian Marzocchis fitted to our 83 Cagiva. But I certainly do know that back in 1983, these 125 Cagivas were originally fitted with a single Öhlins monoshock at the rear, and our particular bike here appears to still have its original suspension unit still bolted on with its accompanying remote gas and oil reservoir there strapped onto the side of the chassis. And this rear shock was bolted onto the chassis at the top with a remote linkage system bolted on at the bottom where it's mounted onto the bike's rear swing arm. Now again, and just like all of the other motocross bike manufacturers of the 1980s, it seemed that all of those manufacturers had to have a name for their rear suspension systems of their bikes, because Honda, of course, had the Pro Link, Yamaha had the monocross suspension system, Kawasaki had their Unitrack, and of course Suzuki had the full floater. So Cagiva had to stay in line with that particular trend, and so they called their rear suspension system Soft Damp, which as you can see, it's just a basic alloy box section swing arm with a linkage connecting that rear shock to the frame. Although despite all of these manufacturers giving fancy names to their bikes' rear suspension systems, in reality there was never really much in the way of differences in their construction, and although some did perform slightly better than others, they still all did exactly the same job on the track. And once again, another trend of these 1980 motocrossers was to fit plastic fuel tanks on their off-road bikes, and this Cagiva fuel cell here normally held around 8 litres of premix fuel, which was usually enough to keep that 125 two-stroke motor fed with its fuel on even the longest of motocross races. But as Italian motorcycle fuel tanks go, these Cagiva fuel cells certainly looked pretty stylish. And just, of course, below the fuel tank, we had these plastic air scoops fitted to try and help direct the oncoming airflow into the bike's radiator, just to try and help reduce the temperature of the coolant in the motor when that 125 engine was working hard. And although these parts may look just like cosmetic bits and pieces, they actually did help cool that radiator down. And once more, a decent seat fitted on our little 125, although some of the magazine bike tests on this bike from 1983 did say that the packing foam on this seat was just far too soft, and when you slung your leg over the bike and sat down on it, all of its cushioning effect completely disappeared. But then again, that could also depend on the actual weight of the rider, of course, if you get my meaning. Now, more original 1983 parts on our Italian Cagiva, and all of these controls, including the bars and levers and grips, are all basically still the stock items from that 1983 year, and the bike still has all of its Magura ball end levers and rubber lever pivot covers all still intact. But I'm pretty sure that the bike's control cables will have been replaced at one time, which is not surprising, that when you consider this bike's heading for 40 years old now. But again, it's just great to take a look at one of these Italian stallions once more. Now, as I remember, I think it was around 1983 that Cagiva did a deal with the other Italian off-road bike manufacturer, TGM, or they maybe bought them over. I'm not entirely sure of the background of that particular transaction, but when you take a look at this 1982 TGM 125, the resemblance to our 83 Cagiva is pretty close, and apart from maybe one or two subtle differences with that Hyro motor and the front forks, this bike here looks identical to our old 1983 Cagiva. So exactly which manufacturer influenced the other, I'm not entirely sure. But when you take a look at this 1982 TGM 125, now this is a brand new bike from 1982 that's never ever had a drop of fuel put in it or even been started ever since it left the TGM factory in that year. And so, as you can see, you don't have to be an expert on 80s European dirt bikes to see that there is certainly a good connection here between both Italian bike builders of TGM and our featured 1983 Cagiva 125 pictured here at the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. Although I'm still glad that we got Nigel to dig this little machine out for us all to have a look at, because for 1983 these 125 Cagivas were fantastic little bikes, because it was relatively light at just around the 200 pounds mark, and that tubular steel frame was both very strong and it made the bike very flickable as well, and the front and rear suspensions were good enough for the early 1980s, but to top it all, it had an excellent, compact and powerful two-stroke liquid-cooled motor. Now, of course, nobody's saying here that these Cagivas were the very best 125s of that year, because they did have their little idiosyncrasies, as every other motocross bike suffered from at that time. But for a smaller European motocross manufacturer, these little Italian stallions were still very highly competitive, and they did give a good account of themselves when they took on the might of the big four Japanese bikes of Honda, Suzuki, Yamaha and Kawasaki. But Cagiva were just one of a number of small Italian race bike manufacturers from that 1980s period who were producing top-class off-road race machines that were hugely popular in their native Europe, and many could also be seen popping up internationally in places like the USA. But once again, another iconic race bike from the 1980s, and certainly a bike that you very seldom see at vintage race events these days. But it's thanks once again to the bike's owner Nigel Green and the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show that we can feature it here on my YouTube channel. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that walk around that lovely little Cagiva 125 WMX from 1983. Another nice iconic European machine, and certainly a bike that you very seldom see these days, although that particular owner of that bike, Nigel Green, did tell me that he has at least another 30 of those Cagivas in his workshop, so is it little wonder that we don't see any of them out there on the racetrack these days, when Nigel has almost the entire population of these bikes locked away in his garage. So coming up in my next video, we're going to stay with the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and in my next video posting we'll be taking a look at this beautifully restored 1960s Greaves machine. Now this is another one of the fantastic bikes that I filmed at the 2022 show, and we'll be taking a much closer look at this beautiful machine when we return to my video channel. But until the next time, of course, everybody out there, continue to be safe and well when you're riding those old vintage dirt bikes, and don't forget to retune to my channel so we can talk about more vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.